This story is not mine. It belongs to a man from China, a stranger whose pain spilled onto a corner of the internet that most people would scroll past without stopping. I found it one night while wandering through threads of confessions and regrets, and something about the way he wrote pulled me in. His words were not polished, they were raw, jagged, the kind of words that come from someone who has been broken so thoroughly that he no longer cares how his story sounds. I decided to tell it here because, once I finished reading it, I knew it was not something that should vanish into the noise of forgotten posts. He began simply, with a confession of suffering. I suffered for at least half a year, and now I am finally ready to push her into the deepest abyss of hell. Those were his first words. Not an introduction, not a warm memory of love, but the language of torment, of a man who had lived too long in silence. His suffering was not physical, it was betrayal, the kind that eats away from the inside, one slow bite at a time until there is nothing left to protect you. He met her years before, back in 2006, during a vacation. He saw her for the first time on a trip and swore to himself that he would not let her slip away. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He promised he would make her his, and in time, he succeeded. He poured everything into her, every drop of love and devotion he could summon. He wrote that he did not just love her. He loved her with a purity that bordered on madness, with a loyalty that refused to crack. His devotion was almost religious. He believed she would be his salvation, his family, his future. But he also worked a job that demanded constant travel, weeks away from home, sometimes months, coming back with bags full of exhaustion and a heart full of longing. He admitted that distance was always a weakness, and while he tried to make up for it with calls, messages, small gifts, the truth was that absence breeds doubt, and doubt breeds secrets. He never wanted to admit it, but in hindsight he saw it clearly. For a long time he convinced himself nothing was wrong. Love makes you blind when you want it to. He ignored the signs, her sudden defensiveness, the way she clutched her phone when he walked into the room, the late nights she claimed were spent working. Even when her laughter felt too sharp, too hidden, he told himself it was his imagination. He wanted to believe in her more than he wanted to believe in reality. The truth came in the most ordinary way possible. He had an old email account he barely used, a dusty corner of the digital world he checked maybe once a year. One day, by chance, he opened it. Inside were hotel receipts, places he had never been, rooms he had never booked. At first he thought it was a mistake, a clerical error. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. There were notes, small details in the bills, things that only made sense if she had been there with someone else. That was when the collapse began. He described it not as rage, but as emptiness, the kind of void that swallows every breath. He did not scream, he did not break things. He simply sat there, staring at the screen, feeling his body hollow out. Love, he realized, does not end with explosions. It ends with silence, the suffocating kind that makes you question every second of your life.
But inside that silence, something else began to form. Not healing, not acceptance, something darker. He began to imagine punishment, not the petty kind, not shouting matches or slammed doors. He wanted something permanent, something that would stain her life as deeply as she had stained his. He wrote about how the thought first arrived like smoke creeping into his mind during sleepless nights. If she had poisoned his love, why couldn't he poison her life? At first, he shook it away, but the thought returned again and again, growing stronger each time. Soon it was no longer just an idea, it became his companion, whispering that balance could be restored only through suffering. He continued to live beside her, as though nothing had changed. He still ate meals at the same table, still exchanged small talk, still watched her go about her life with that same easy smile. But inside, he was unraveling. He began to watch her not with love, but with the cold eyes of a predator. Every gesture, every secretive glance at her phone fed his hatred. What pushed him further was the realization that she did not even seem guilty. She laughed, she smiled, she carried herself as though nothing weighed on her. That, he said, was the deepest insult. Not only had she betrayed him, but she had done it with ease. She had carried on as though his devotion meant nothing, as though he was too blind, too weak to notice. He became obsessed with the idea of retribution. He began to imagine ways to leave scars on her life that could never heal. That was when chance introduced him to someone who could make the fantasy real. He had connections, friends of friends, people who blurred the line between respectable and dangerous. Among them was a doctor, a man who knew more than he should have. The doctor became the pivot. He listened as the Chinese man explained his pain not in full detail, but enough to make clear what he wanted. The doctor hesitated at first, but eventually he offered a possibility. There were patients. There was blood. And blood could carry more than oxygen. Blood could carry punishment. That was when the plan was born in its final form. Not shouting, not violence, but infection. A punishment invisible yet eternal, carried inside her body until the end of her life. The man described how his hands trembled the first time he allowed himself to imagine it fully. It was not fear. It was awe. The symmetry of it overwhelmed him. She had poisoned him with betrayal. He would poison her with something far worse. He wrote about patience as though it were religion. Rage wants immediacy, but revenge requires timing. He studied her life, her habits, her vulnerabilities. He rehearsed scenarios in his mind like a soldier practicing for battle. He wrote that he could almost feel it happening already, as though the plan had already taken place and he was only reliving it in memory.
The more he planned, the calmer he became. His hatred no longer screamed inside him. It became steady, cold, efficient. He no longer thought of himself as a victim, but as an executioner. And in that role, he found peace. The first part of his story ends not with action, but with resolve. By the time he finished writing, he had already decided. The betrayal had not destroyed his love. It had twisted it into obsession, into something unrecognizable. He no longer dreamed of reconciliation. He no longer cared about forgiveness. All that remained was the certainty that she would pay, that he would drag her into the same abyss he had been forced to live in. The man's words did not end in hesitation. When he left off in the first half of his confession, he had already chosen his path. He had carried betrayal like a tumor inside his chest, feeding it with silence and doubt until it hardened into purpose. Now that purpose took on form, sharp and merciless. He no longer asked himself whether it was right. That question had withered months ago. The only question left was when. He described the strange peace that came with this decision. People imagine vengeance as fire, a blaze that consumes. For him, it was ice. He no longer burned with rage at the sight of her. He no longer felt his stomach twist when she smiled at her phone or slipped out with vague excuses. Instead, he watched with the patience of someone who knew the ending before the story finished. Every move she made was another step toward the trap, another thread tightening around her. The doctor had not been easy to persuade. At first there had been disbelief, then resistance, then the long pause of someone who knows they are being asked to cross a line they can never return from. But money has gravity, and so does misery. When you combine both, even the strongest resistance begins to bend. The man wrote that it was not a single conversation that secured his help, but many, each one pushing further, each one testing boundaries. He offered payment. He offered silence. He offered the satisfaction of helping someone punish betrayal. Eventually, the doctor agreed. The arrangement was grotesque in its simplicity. Access was granted to samples, to blood drawn from patients who carried within them the very punishment the man sought to inflict. He did not describe details, perhaps because some lines cannot be written even in anonymous confession, but the implication was clear. He had gained possession of the very thing he believed would deliver balance. Something microscopic, invisible, permanent. From that point on, the narrative darkened further. He began to write of her not as a partner, not even as a traitor, but as prey. Every interaction was catalogued. When she left her toothbrush on the counter, when she set her glass of water down, when she carried groceries in from the car. He studied her movements not with love, but with forensic precision. The planning became obsessive. He knew her routines more intimately than she did. Yet there was no rush. That was the most chilling part of his story. He did not want immediacy. He wanted inevitability. Waiting was its own kind of ecstasy. Each day that passed without her knowledge, each night she slept beside him unaware,
made him feel like a god playing with mortality. He was the only one who knew the script, and she was stumbling through it blind. But obsession does not come without cracks. He admitted that sometimes late at night, the old love resurfaced. He would watch her sleep and remember the early days, the vacation where it all began, the promise he made to himself to never let her go. For a brief moment he would ache, torn between devotion and destruction. But the ache always soured. Love had been twisted too far to heal. The memories no longer comforted him. They mocked him. And so even those moments fed his determination. He described the first attempt. It was clumsy, driven by nerves. He prepared everything with precision, rehearsed every movement in his head, and yet when the moment came, his hands betrayed him. He hesitated, shaking, drenched in sweat, until the opportunity slipped away. She never noticed, never suspected, but he spent the night in torment, furious at his own weakness. The second attempt came easier. Each rehearsal stripped away hesitation. Each failure made him colder. He no longer trembled at the thought of what he was doing. He no longer heard the faint voice of conscience whispering against it. By then, he had silenced that voice completely. What unsettled him most was not the act itself, but how quickly life returned to normal afterward. She smiled, laughed, carried on as if nothing had changed. To her, the days blurred together in the same rhythm they always had. To him, every second now carried the weight of his secret. He described it as living in two realities at once. In hers, everything was ordinary. In his, every glance, every touch was shadowed by the knowledge of what he had done.
He did not know when the results would show. That was part of the torment and part of the pleasure. Punishment delivered invisibly is punishment stretched over time. Each day she looked healthy was another day of suspense. Each laugh that rang too bright was another insult, but also another promise that it could not last forever. And yet, he confessed, the waiting became unbearable. Doubt gnawed at him again. Had he done it correctly? Had chance betrayed him, as she had? Was it possible she would escape even this? He found himself spiraling, obsessively replaying every detail, every step, searching for mistakes. The silence of not knowing was worse than the silence of betrayal. Months passed. He did not describe in detail what signs he saw, only that eventually he noticed changes, small at first, invisible to anyone else, fatigue she could not explain, weight she could not keep. He wrote of the satisfaction that bloomed in him then, the sense of balance returning to the world. She had carved betrayal into his life. Now her own body carried its mirror. But satisfaction did not bring peace. If anything, it sharpened his obsession. Once he had crossed the line, there was no going back. He became addicted to watching her decline, measuring every cough, every restless night. Love had long since turned to poison, but now even hatred transformed. It was no longer enough to punish her. He wanted to witness her suffer fully. He wanted to see the universe complete its work. And still, he carried the mask of normalcy. To everyone else, they were the same couple. No one suspected. She did not know. She was already marked. He moved through his days with eerie calm, the kind that only comes from carrying a secret so large it numbs every other feeling. He wrote that even his friends noticed he seemed lighter, happier, as though he had finally healed from the betrayal. They congratulated him on moving forward, never realizing what he had done.
Toward the end of his confession, his words took on a strange tone. Not triumphant, not guilty, but almost philosophical. He wrote about the nature of betrayal, about how it does not simply end a relationship, but rewrites identity. He believed he was no longer the man he had been before. Betrayal had killed that man, and what remained was something else entirely, someone who had shed love and morality in exchange for power. He wrote that this transformation was irreversible, that once you have tasted the kind of revenge that bleeds into blood, you can never return to who you were. And yet, beneath the philosophy, there was still bitterness. He admitted that even as he watched her suffer, even as he believed he had won, the emptiness remained. The betrayal had carved a hole too deep to be filled, even with revenge. He had thought that watching her decline would heal him, but instead it only reminded him of the man he used to be, the one who loved her without condition. That man was gone, and all he had left was the silence of what he had become. The confession ended without closure. He did not describe her final state, did not say whether she ever learned the truth. Perhaps he wanted to leave it unfinished, or perhaps the story itself had no real ending. What he gave instead was a warning, though it was unclear who it was meant for. He wrote that betrayal creates ghosts. Some haunt in sadness, others in anger, but the worst are those who refuse to die until they have pulled someone else into the grave with them. When I closed his story, I felt the weight of it pressing against me. It was not just a tale of infidelity or revenge, it was a descent, a record of how betrayal mutates love into obsession, how pain becomes justification for cruelty. He had wanted to drag her into hell, but in the process, he had already descended there himself. That was his universe of vengeance, the abyss he chose to inhabit. And once you see a story like that, you cannot forget it. It lingers in the silence, in the spaces between breaths, reminding you how fragile love can be and how easily devotion can turn into something monstrous.